Hi, this is Cora Stack again, Dr. Stack. I wanted to talk about this. It's just following on from my previous video, and it's just the way the thoughts emerge, and what the next question is, following from the previous question. So the title of this video is The Constitutional Logic of Ireland. I'm very interested in constitutional logic because, well, as a mathematician, it's something that is intriguing. And looking at the Irish Constitution, what is the constitutional logic? It's an interesting question, and looking at it in different ways. As I say, it's like conic sections in mathematics. You slice it in all kinds of different ways, and you get different, different geometric figures from cutting a cone in many different ways through conic, what's called a conic, and then you end up with conic sections. So I'm kind of doing conic sections to the Constitution. So the constitutional logic of Ireland, and a question we need to ask. In Ireland, power is not supposed to be arbitrary. I'm interested in the dynamics of power. It's something that's fascinating, and you can see it everywhere. And it's very interesting to see how the dynamics of power influence all kinds of situations. So it follows a clear constitutional logic. This is what I'm saying now: a hierarchy that defines who truly holds authority. First, the people. Second, the Constitution. Third, the institutions of the state. And fourth, political actors. This is not just theory, it's the foundation of constitutional democracy as I see it. Because the Constitution of Ireland begins with we, the people. These words matter. They establish that sovereignty does not belong to the government or to the courts or to political leaders. It belongs to the people. Only the people can amend the Constitution through referendum. No institution can override that. From there, the Constitution becomes the supreme law of the state. Every law passed by the Oireachtas must comply with it. Every action of the Government of Ireland must operate within it, including political actors, must operate within the constraints of the Constitution. If they do not, they can be challenged and struck down. The institutions of the state exist because of the Constitution: the legislature, the executive, and the courts, including the Supreme Court of Ireland. But none of these are sovereign. They all derive their authority from the Constitution and are limited or constrained by it. Political actors, ministers, office holders, elected representatives do not possess independent power. They exercise delegated authority, and they must act within constitutional boundaries. These decisions may be reviewed, these actions may be challenged in practice. So how is this hierarchy maintained in practice? Through several key mechanisms: judicial review, referendums, legal challenges brought by citizens, and the separation of powers. This is how constitutional logic becomes real as I understand it. And this brings us then to the role of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of Ireland does not govern the state. It does not supervise political power in a general sense. Instead, it does something more precise and more important. It interprets the Constitution. It resolves disputes. It determines whether laws or actions comply with constitutional principles. So let's look at that again. What the Supreme Court does: it interprets the Constitution, it resolves disputes, it determines whether laws and actions comply with constitutional principles, but it can only act when cases are brought before it. It does not initiate, it responds. It does not stand above the Constitution. It gives effects to it, as I understand it now, looking at the hierarchy and so on. And that leads to a deeper question: what happens if over time fewer constitutional challenges are brought? Not because important constitutional challenges now, significant ones. I'm not diminishing any particular constitutional challenges, but so there are probably ones that are considered more substantial or significant than other ones. But what happens if over time fewer constitutional challenges are brought to the Supreme Court? Not because the Constitution has changed, but because accessing it has become more difficult. And I talk a lot about access to justice, and this is a particularly important case, where access to justice is made very difficult to initiate constitutional challenges. If legal action becomes too complex, too costly, too burdensome, then over time, naturally, fewer people will bring cases. And if fewer cases reach the courts, then fewer constitutional questions are tested. This is not a dramatic collapse, it's something quieter, a gradual shift. Rights still exist, but are less frequently asserted. Power still exists, but are less frequently challenged. The Constitution remains supreme in theory, but becomes less active in practice. Over time, that kind of drift raises a serious issue. And I'm just looking at this now, not just in terms of the Irish case, but in terms of all constitutional democracies and what may be happening with regard to, the overreach of political of the political actors or the political system vis-a-vis the constitutional system, because of the barriers to justice, the access to justice, just in terms of the route to constitutional review. That just not there's a whole lot of other areas we could look at access to justice, but particularly in terms of constitutional review, because a constitutional democracy depends not only on courts willing to decide, but on citizens willing and able to challenge. And if that's made impossible through exorbitant costs, or there are so many we'll say legal actors, or solicitors or barristers, the legal system, who are being paid by the state largely, and who are reluctant then to help people challenge constitutional matters, because there's a conflict of interest and there's huge payment to the state. Now, this is an interesting question in itself. Should this be allowed to happen? Or should this conflict of interest be allowed to happen in the first place? I mean, that's another question, so we'll leave that to one side. So here is the question we might ask, or we should ask. In modern Ireland, or indeed in other constitutional democracies, under the Constitution of Ireland, is access to constitutional justice, has it become too difficult, too costly, or too complex? What is the long-term risk to constitutional democracy itself? Just in Ireland, but I'd say this would apply in other constitutional democracies as well. And perhaps the sharper question is this: does a constitution remain truly powerful if fewer and fewer people are able to invoke it, particularly if the questions are very deep, very profound, and are challenging the state, for example? So there are just a couple of questions to ask following my previous video and my own personal experience, and others, I'm sure. And I think it's a question that just doesn't apply to Irish constitutional democracies, it would apply to constitutional democracies elsewhere. But I think it's worth asking that question and opening it up for a debate, because I mean, if the Constitution is rendered ineffective over time by all kinds of barriers being put up to challenging it, then that's a very serious matter for constitutional democracy, and that's just a question to, I suppose, to reflect on. And my own experience would certainly reflect the challenges and the pressures that are on ordinary people to take challenges, very serious challenges, to the courts, particularly when you're asking questions about potential government overreach. And I'm sure this is a major issue in many constitutional democracies, which a question that needs to be asked and considered and reflected upon.